How did people raise children 50,000 years ago? You spend hours worrying about your child, whether they're getting enough attention, whether too much screen time will damage their brain, whether you're reading enough books to them, whether you're accidentally ruining their future. It's strange, because for almost all of human history, none of these questions existed. 50,000 years ago, a child could die from a snake bite before sunset. A winter storm could erase an entire family. Food could disappear for weeks. Yet somehow, humans survived. Not only survived, they became the most successful species on Earth. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If raising children today is supposedly easier than ever, why does it feel so much harder? We tend to imagine prehistoric parents as primitive, barely surviving, constantly struggling. But that picture says more about us than it does about them. Because when most people imagine a child 50,000 years ago, they imagine a smaller version of a modern child dropped into the wilderness, a child who would be terrified, lost, helpless. But that's not what happened. That child belonged there. The world that looks hostile to us was the only world they had ever known. Therefore, what looks like hardship from a distance often looked normal from the inside. And that changes everything. The first thing that surprises researchers is how little prehistoric parenting resembled modern parenting. Today, childhood is managed, scheduled, supervised, measured. Every hour belongs to someone, a teacher, a coach, a parent, a screen. But for most of human history, children spent enormous amounts of time without direct supervision, not because adults didn't care, but because adults couldn't afford to watch them constantly. Food had to be gathered, shelters had to be maintained, the group had to survive. Therefore, children learned something modern children rarely learn: responsibility. Not through lectures, not through educational videos, but through necessity. A 6-year-old hunter-gatherer child wasn't expected to act like an adult, but they were expected to contribute, maybe gathering berries, maybe carrying water, maybe watching younger children. Small tasks repeated every day. Therefore, competence arrived earlier, not because prehistoric children were smarter, but because the environment demanded it. And environments shape psychology far more than motivational speeches ever will.
This creates an uncomfortable realization. Modern childhood is often designed around protection, but protection and competence are natural enemies. The more we remove risk, the fewer opportunities there are to develop confidence. The fewer opportunities there are to develop confidence, the more fragile people become. This cycle appears again and again throughout history. We solve one problem, but create another. Yet the biggest difference wasn't freedom, it was community. Today, many parents raise children alone or close to alone, maybe 2 adults, sometimes 1, a handful of relatives if they're lucky. But a hunter-gatherer child belonged to an entire tribe. Anthropologists sometimes call this allo-parenting, which is a complicated word for a very simple idea. Everybody helped. Grandparents helped, older children helped, aunts helped, uncles helped, neighbors helped. Anyone nearby helped. Therefore, raising a child wasn't a private project, it was a collective responsibility. This matters more than people realize because humans evolved expecting many caregivers, not one exhausted parent trying to do everything. The modern parent often feels guilty for being overwhelmed, but overwhelm might be exactly what we'd expect when a job designed for 20 people gets handed to 1. The problem isn't necessarily the parent. The problem may be the environment. Again, the same pattern appears. Humans adapt to one world, then suddenly find themselves living in another. And children absorbed lessons constantly, not through formal education, but through observation. If you wanted to learn how to make tools, you watched. If you wanted to learn how to track animals, you watched. If you wanted to understand your place in the tribe, you watched. Learning wasn't separated from life. Learning was life. Therefore, childhood wasn't preparation for reality. It was reality. Modern psychology often talks about identity crises, people reaching adulthood without knowing who they are. Hunter-gatherer societies had many problems. Identity usually wasn't one of them, because from childhood, roles were visible. You could see what adults did. You could see where you fit. You could see why your contribution mattered. Meaning wasn't something you searched for. Meaning you participated in every day.
But there was a darker side. A child 50,000 years ago faced realities we can barely imagine. Death wasn't hidden. It wasn't sanitized. It wasn't moved behind hospital walls. Children saw it. They understood it. They grew up knowing life was fragile. Therefore, they developed a relationship with mortality much earlier than we do. And perhaps that's one reason ancient humans often appear psychologically tougher than we expect. Not because suffering is good, but because reality was impossible to ignore. Today, we spend enormous energy trying to eliminate uncertainty. We ensure everything, predict everything, plan everything. But our ancestors lived inside uncertainty every single day. And strangely enough, humans evolved there, not here, which may explain why modern anxiety feels so peculiar. We have more safety than any generation before us, but many people feel less secure, because security is not simply the absence of danger. Security is confidence in your ability to face danger. Those are very different things. And maybe that's the lesson hidden inside prehistoric childhood. Not that we should abandon modern life, not that we should raise children in forests, not that everything old was better. History is never that simple. The real lesson is more uncomfortable. For 50,000 years, children grew up surrounded by community, responsibility, purpose, and participation. Then, within a few centuries, we replaced much of that with institutions, systems, schedules, screens. And now we wonder why something feels missing. The strange thing is that modern parenting advice keeps getting more complicated. More books, more experts, more techniques, more strategies. But human beings did not become human because they mastered parenting techniques. They became human because they belonged to groups, because children learned through participation, because responsibility arrived gradually, because meaning existed before achievement. Perhaps that's why so many adults secretly feel nostalgic for a childhood they never had. Not because prehistoric life was easy. It wasn't. It was brutal, dangerous, unforgiving. But it offered something modern life often struggles to provide: a clear sense of belonging. And belonging may be one of the oldest psychological needs we possess. Older than civilization, older than agriculture, older than cities, possibly older than language itself. Maybe the question isn't how people raised children 50,000 years ago. Maybe the question is why the human mind still seems designed for that world. Because beneath the smartphones, the schools, the careers, the endless notifications, there is still a brain shaped by campfires, a brain expecting a tribe, a brain expecting responsibility, a brain expecting meaning, and every generation keeps discovering the same thing. You can change the world around a human being, but changing the human being is much harder. History keeps proving that.